Right now, you can swipe through thousands of strangers before breakfast. You can meet someone from another city, another country, another continent, all without leaving your couch. Now erase all of that. Erase the apps, the cities, the strangers. What's left is your tribe, maybe 30 people, and every single one of them is already tangled into your family tree. That was dating 50,000 years ago. No outside options, no neighboring town to check out, just the same faces you grew up around, the same bloodline circling back on itself generation after generation. And here's the detail that should make you uncomfortable. When scientists sequenced the DNA of a Neanderthal woman who lived around that time, they found something unsettling. Her mother and father weren't just related, they were half-siblings, and she wasn't some rare exception. Later studies on other Neanderthal remains kept turning up the same pattern, small isolated groups, genetics folding in on themselves again and again. So picture your own situation, 30 people, no strangers walking in, no fresh faces at the market. On paper, inbreeding should have been unavoidable. It should have been the default outcome for almost every small group of early humans on Earth, but it wasn't. Most tribes didn't collapse under the weight of their own family tree. Somehow, generation after generation, people kept finding partners who weren't too close, weren't too related, weren't going to pass down the same fragile genes twice. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because early humans built something most of them probably never consciously designed, a system. Not one solution, but three, stacked on top of each other, working at the same time without anyone writing it down. One lived inside the brain, one lived inside tribal law, and one lived on the trails connecting tribe to tribe, hundreds of miles apart. Before we get into how each one worked, hit subscribe, because this channel is where stories like this live, the hidden systems your ancestors built just to survive being human. The first line of defense didn't come from a rule someone wrote down. It came from something wired directly into the brain, long before language even existed. Scientists call it the Westermarck effect. Here's the basic mechanism. When two children spend their earliest years in close physical proximity, sharing food, sleeping nearby, growing up side by side, something in the brain quietly files them away under a specific label. Not romantic, not sexual. Something closer to family automatically, regardless of whether they actually share blood. That last part matters. The trigger isn't genetics, it's proximity during a critical window of early childhood. Your brain isn't checking DNA, it's checking who was around you when you were small. The clearest evidence for this comes from a very unlikely place, 20th century Israel. Researchers studying communal settlements called kibbutzim noticed something strange. Children raised together from infancy in the same peer group, unrelated, no blood connection at all, almost never married each other as adults. Not because it was banned. Not because anyone told them not to. When researchers looked closer, they found something closer to indifference. These children grew up, looked at each other, and simply felt nothing romantic at all, as if some switch had been quietly flipped off years earlier. Think about what that means. A mechanism that requires no laws, no punishment, no one enforcing anything, just childhood proximity doing the work silently in the background. But there's a flip side, and it's just as revealing. Sometimes siblings are separated very young, adopted out, raised apart, and don't meet again until adulthood. In some documented cases, when they reunite as strangers, they report intense attraction toward each other. Researchers call this genetic sexual attraction. It's important to be careful here. This isn't backed by large-scale studies, mostly individual case reports, so treat it as suggestive rather than settled science. But it lines up with the same underlying pattern. Take away early proximity, and the automatic family label never gets installed, even when the blood relation is real. Put those two observations together and the logic becomes hard to ignore. Your brain was never actually built to track ancestry. It was built to track closeness in early childhood, and it uses that as a rough, imperfect proxy for, this person is family, don't pursue this romantically. For a small hunter-gatherer band, that's an efficient system. You don't need every member consciously calculating who's too closely related to whom. The brain does the filtering automatically, quietly, before desire even has a chance to form. Here's a strange thought worth sitting with. Your closest childhood friend, the one who felt like a brother or sister growing up even without shared blood, might feel that way partly because of this exact mechanism. The same wiring that once protected small tribes from genetic collapse is still running in you right now. But powerful as it was, this instinct alone wasn't airtight. It only covered people you grew up around. It said nothing about cousins arriving from another camp, or relatives you'd never actually lived beside. Early humans needed something more deliberate, something written into law. The brain's instinct only covered people you actually grew up beside. It said nothing about a cousin from a neighboring camp or a relative you'd only met a handful of times. That gap needed a different kind of solution, one that couldn't rely on chance proximity. So tribes built something more deliberate: explicit marriage law. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have documented a recurring structure called moieties, essentially splitting the entire tribe into two halves. Every person belonged to one half or the other, usually by birth. The rule was simple and absolute. You could only marry into the opposite half. It didn't matter how you felt about someone. If they were in your half, they were off limits, full stop. Layered on top of that was something called cross-cousin marriage. This is where the logic gets interesting. Not all cousins were treated the same. Marrying certain cousins was expected, even encouraged. Marrying others was strictly forbidden. The difference came down to which parent's side the relationship traced through, a distinction that, whether or not anyone understood the biology behind it, reliably kept genetic distance wide enough to matter. The most detailed version of this system comes from Aboriginal Australian societies, well documented in ethnographic research. Some groups used what's called an 8-subsection system. At birth, a child wasn't just given a name. They were slotted into one of 8 categories that, decades before they could speak, had already determined which category of person they were permitted to marry. It sounds rigid because it was, but that rigidity was the entire point. Remove ambiguity and you remove the risk of it being ignored. And the consequences for breaking these rules weren't minor. In many documented hunter-gatherer societies, violating marriage law could mean exile from the group. Picture what that actually meant. No hospitals, no neighboring supermarket, no backup plan. Survival outside the tribe, alone in an unforgiving landscape, was close to a death sentence. These weren't soft social suggestions. They were rules enforced with the highest possible stakes. Here's the logical thread connecting all of it. Instinct alone was quiet and automatic, but limited to people you'd physically grown up around. Law was loud, explicit, and could reach cousins, in-laws, anyone the tribe had a name for, backed by consequences severe enough that almost no one dared test them. If you're finding this system stricter than you expected, that reaction is worth sitting with for a second. Drop a comment and let me know. Together, instinct and law covered almost everyone inside the tribe. But there was still one glaring problem neither of them could solve. If you couldn't marry inside your own group, and your group was all you had, where exactly was anyone supposed to find a partner at all? Instinct and law had done their job, but only within the walls of one tribe. Neither could conjure a partner out of thin air when every available face was already ruled out. So the system needed a third layer, one that didn't just filter who you couldn't choose, but actively created someone new to choose from. That meant looking outward, past your own camp, toward people your tribe had never met. The answer wasn't going to come from inside, it was going to come from the trail. The third layer wasn't inside the tribe at all. It existed on the paths between tribes, and it depended on something early humans couldn't survive without: regular contact with strangers. Across hunter-gatherer societies, archaeologists and anthropologists have documented seasonal gatherings, moments when multiple bands would deliberately converge at the same place at the same time of year, often tied to a predictable resource like a salmon run, a fruiting season, or a migration of game. On the surface, these gatherings look like practical logistics. Underneath, they were doing something far more important. They were the only reliable mechanism for meeting someone who wasn't already a cousin. Picture what that would have meant for a young person in one of these bands. Most of the year, your world was 30 familiar faces, the same voices, same routines, same family lines. Then, once a year, maybe once every few years, camps that had never crossed paths suddenly sat around the same fire. For a teenager who had grown up seeing the exact same people since birth, that gathering wasn't just a supply run. It was likely the first time in their life they'd ever stood across from someone whose face they didn't already know by heart, someone who wasn't already ruled out by law or by instinct. The archaeological record backs up how far these networks actually stretched. Researchers have traced shell ornaments, certain stone tool materials, and decorative objects found hundreds of miles from their original source passed hand to hand along trade routes that connected group after group. Those objects weren't just cargo. They were proof of contact, evidence that people were meeting, exchanging, and almost certainly intermarrying across that same distance. In a very real sense, the paths that carried a shell from a distant coast into an inland camp were the same paths that carried a future spouse. Here's the part worth sitting with. Strength, speed, hunting skill, none of that determined whether your genetic line survived the next few generations. Staying connected did. A tribe that kept showing up to these gatherings, kept trading, kept intermarrying with distant groups, kept its gene pool wide and its future secure. A tribe that stopped showing up was quietly gambling with its own survival, whether anyone realized it or not. That reframes something people usually get backwards about evolution. It's tempting to picture survival of the fittest as the strongest individual winning alone. But for early humans, the fittest weren't the strongest. They were the most connected, the ones who kept the trail open, kept the invitation standing, kept saying yes to the next gathering, even when it meant a long, difficult walk to reach it. So by this point, the system had 3 layers working together. Instinct quietly ruled out childhood companions. Law explicitly ruled out most of the tribe. And distant networks supplied the one thing neither of the first two could: someone entirely new. On paper, it should have worked almost everywhere, and for most of human history, it did, but not always. And what happened when this third layer failed reveals exactly how fragile the whole system really was. Now go back to that Neanderthal woman from the beginning of this video, the one whose parents turned out to be half-siblings. She wasn't an isolated glitch in the data. She was a symptom of a system that had already broken down. By the time some of the last Neanderthal populations were living in Eurasia tens of thousands of years ago, genetic studies of their remains reveal something troubling. Researchers sequencing DNA from small, late-surviving groups have repeatedly found the same signature: low genetic diversity, close relative pairings showing up generation after generation, populations that look, genetically, like they had nowhere else to turn. One especially detailed case comes from Siberian cave sites, where researchers examining remains from small family groups found genetic diversity levels far below what a healthy, well-connected population should show. The picture that emerges isn't one dramatic event. It's something slower and quieter. A handful of related individuals, generation after generation, with little or no evidence of new genetic material entering from outside. No trace of the wide trade networks. No signature of distant contact, nothing suggesting anyone new ever arrived at their fire. Think back to the 3-layer system. Instinct only works if children grow up around enough unrelated peers to redirect attention elsewhere. Law only works if there's a large enough population to actually enforce meaningful boundaries. And the network layer, arguably the most important safety valve, only works if there are other groups within reach and a reliable way to keep reaching them. For some of these late Neanderthal populations, spread thin, isolated by geography or shrinking numbers, that third layer appears to have simply stopped functioning. It's worth being careful here. Some researchers believe this kind of sustained inbreeding may have contributed to Neanderthal extinction, weakening immune resilience, increasing inherited health problems, shrinking the population's ability to adapt. But this isn't a fully settled conclusion. Extinction almost certainly involved multiple overlapping pressures, climate shifts, competition, changing ecosystems. Genetic isolation looks like one thread in that story, not the entire explanation. Still, the contrast is hard to ignore. Populations that stayed connected to wider networks show far more genetic diversity in the fossil record. Populations that didn't show exactly the pattern you'd predict from 3 generations of a shrinking, closed system, quietly running out of new genetic material with nowhere left to source it. Which means the very thing that sounded almost bureaucratic earlier, seasonal gatherings, trade routes, distant kin, wasn't a nice cultural bonus layered on top of survival. For at least some of these isolated groups, it may have been the difference between a lineage that continued and one that didn't. None of this stayed in the past. Every culture anthropologists have ever studied has some version of an incest taboo, different boundaries, different definitions of too close, but the pattern itself shows up everywhere. A strong hint this isn't just cultural preference, it's something deeper running underneath. The law layer never disappeared either, it just changed shape. Modern legal systems still define which family relationships can't legally marry, a direct descendant of those tribal marriage rules, just written into statutes instead of subsection systems. And the instinct layer is still running quietly inside you right now. Step-siblings raised together from a young age often report the same discomfort at the idea of dating each other, even knowing there's no blood relation at all. That's the Westermark effect, unbothered by biology, still triggered by nothing more than early proximity, exactly like it was 50,000 years ago. You're not just descended from people who solved this problem once. You're currently walking around with the same solution still installed, so picture yourself back in that tribe of 30. No apps, no neighboring town, just the same handful of faces you've known your whole life. It still looks like an impossible situation, but now you know what was actually happening underneath it the whole time. Your brain was quietly ruling out anyone you'd grown up beside, long before desire ever had a chance to form. Tribal law was ruling out almost everyone else, backed by consequences too severe to ignore. And somewhere out past the edge of camp, a trail was already leading toward a gathering, toward a stranger, toward the one option instinct and law couldn't provide on their own. None of that was luck. It was three systems, biological, legal, and social, running at the same time, mostly invisible to the people living inside them. And the same systems are still running inside you. The discomfort you'd feel toward a sibling, the laws that quietly define your family tree, the instinct that pulls you toward people beyond your own front door. You didn't inherit a fragile species that got lucky. You inherited one that built a system and never stopped running it.